Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. The sale is still going on for Christmas and New Year's over at the Poketown store, so make sure you go ahead and check them out. For today's video, I'm going to be going over another episode of Top Tier Tweaks, looking at 6 decks that I believe are the front runners in the metagame right now, and how I've built them to really be able to compete against all of the other decks that you see within the top tier. I think that's always the most important thing, to shift your deck alongside the meta to make sure that you're able to compete with some of the things that are upticking, and sometimes in downward trends you can prioritize other archetypes. So I think these are the 6 decks that have all had the most top 8 placements in this format, and are all sort of picking up in play in some aspects, and in others looking to be, still just the bread and butter decks that you're going to see a lot of in tournaments. We'll start off with Mewtwo and Mew GX. This is still seeing so much play and is still very successful. Its versatility is one of the main reasons behind that, and it's also pretty much the most aggro deck that we have in the game at the moment. Obviously, there's still Ability Zard, which I think will sort of go hand in hand with Mew 3, but I do think this archetype is pretty much the most tried and trusted list that can get you through pretty much any matchup, and that's just thanks to the many different attackers we have available to us. This is a Mewtwo that I'm rocking with. We've got 20 Pokemon in here, so it's quite a high count. You can see that I've got the Turtonator as my Keldeo answer. I think there's a number of ADP lists that are moving away from Keldeo and are putting in all sorts of things like Buzzmosa or the Bird Trio, but there will still be some regular ADP lists out there for sure. And Turtonator I prefer personally to Greninja GX. Greninja GX either forces you to lower your hand size to 0 to use Greninja to put him into play physically, or you get him into the discard pile and then you can be punished by a Giraffe Rig later on, and both of those options can be negated really by things like Mallow and Lana and such. So I think it's a much slower approach to use the Greninja. I prefer Turtonator to just have more one-hit KO potential in the list, because Turtonator can be a useful cog in all sorts of other matchups, just because he can change the prize trade in different moments. So I like him as my option, and that also leads me to have a thin Mysterious Treasure package, which is also why I've got Mind Report Mewtwo in here. So the decision of Turtonator then changes the other decision-making in the deck, playing treasures over comms, for example, or playing them over a higher tag call engine and stuff like that. So this is just influenced by my preference to Turtonator. You can see as well we're an all basic energy list as well. So all of these decisions have been influenced by the initial choice of Turtonator in the list over Greninja. If you do want to play Greninja, usually you're going to see some Rainbow Energies in here. You're also going to see Guzmahala be part of the tag call package. But right now I'm a very thin tag call engine really. Just 2 copies of tag call and 2 Mallow Lanas. Mallow Lana obviously an incredible card. Still great against things like Malamar, great against ADP, great against all sorts of other decks that are trying to 2-hit KO. So this is still a great card. I still really respect it and want to play 2 copies. You might notice that I'm no longer playing Weak Guard Energy or the Stealthy Hood. So in terms of the game plan against Malamar, if you go first, I think a lot of the time, if your hand is strong, you can go down the bench Mewtwo and try and go for the double welder SBDO play and ruin their board. But if you're going second against Malamar, I think you forego Mewtwo for almost the entire game, and you just try and use the likes of your Charizard Breaks In, your Reshizard, even your Lopuff if you need to. Stuff like this, use these attackers instead and pretty much ignore the Mewtwo the entire time. I think with Malamar moving towards things like Faber in their list, playing Weak Guard doesn't feel safe, playing Stealthy Hood doesn't feel safe. Especially because you would play like low counts of those anyway. It would lead you towards using Guzmahala, which isn't trying to get the Welder high roll to ruin their early game setup. So I think having less answers to Malamar and just sort of having a different game plan as you go into the matchup to be a smarter decision. So I'm not playing either of those cards now that Malamar is pretty much mainlining Faber, and some of them even play Cynthia Caitlyn alongside the Faber. So I'm cutting the one of techs you would be playing. Yes, Weak Guard Energy is somewhat helpful in Mirror as well, but there's so many one-hit KO cards out there anyway in Mewtwo that it feels like it's more of a tempo matchup rather than getting completely blown out by them, because they're going to have 300 damage available to them anyway, throughout the entire game. That the Weak Guard doesn't stop you getting one hit KO'd, it just turns 300 into 600, and that really doesn't matter much. Maybe it matters more on the second Mewtwo when you're going for stamp plays and such, where they have more options in the discard pile to beat you. But at the end of the day, most of the time, they're still forced to find like 4 energy style attackers, and that still requires the welders and all these other pieces. So I think your mirror match isn't that much worse off by not playing one copy of Weak Guard compared to players that will have the Weak Guard, and I think Stealthy Hood is a wasted space right now. Instead, like I said, we've got as much firepower as possible, Turtonator and Magcargo in the list, just to give ourselves more push potential against all sorts of decks. You don't just have the 300 blowout and then you're trying to set up damage elsewhere, then you're reliant on your opponent's GXs in play and such. Keeping Magcargo in here is something that I do really like, just to sit there with on board, because there are so many stamp decks out there right now that essentially, if you can let Mewtwo sit on board for a turn, you can just win the game thanks to Magcargo. There are plenty of decks trying to make it much harder for you, like things like the Tina Chomp deck. They're going to try and like deal with the Mewtwo all in one turn. Or sorry, sometimes they're trying to set up damage. They're trying to do like the 40 poke into the second attack. I can't remember what it's called, Clamter Slash. So basically, having a Magcargo in your discard pile instantly forces them to like use their GX attack, and then they're not taking prize cards. Then you have more time to develop another one. So, like, I prefer just having the option of Magcargo right now, because there are things you want to get through 2 turns in a row. Like the amount of green stacks out there right now, you want to go 300 into 300, and the Magcargo is still like the best way to do that, really. So yeah, as much firepower as possible. We've got this Mewtwo in here to try and recycle Welder off of these treasures. Extra discard synergy as well. Not too much else to say about the list. I've got the high count of Great Catcher. Oh, I'm still playing 3 Dedenne because the card's insane, so you should always play that. And when Mewtwo isn't playing comms, you definitely need to play the 3rd copy. Potentially you can get away with 2. I never really like playing 2 because the card is so important for discard synergy as well as digging towards Welder. If you do play a high comm count, like 3 comms, maybe you can get away with 2, but I almost would never advise it. I'd always make the space for the 3rd. Playing the high Great Catcher counts, it's helpful in Mirror, it's helpful against ADP, it's helpful against all sorts of stuff, and again, it's discard synergy, which is nice. I'm playing an A-Spec Acrobike because I had 1 slot. When you take away the Guzma Hala package, this could either be a Cynthia Caitlyn or a Acrobike, and I prefer it just being a bike. It's a personal preference card. This could also be a Pokecom. This could be a second Marshadow. This could be a 3rd Treasure. This could be, you know, a 3rd Tag Call or a 3rd Switch, whatever you want it to be. Acrobike is the floating space. If you want to put the Naganadel back in the list for sniping the bench, that's also something you can do. But at the moment, I'm just playing an Acrobike. I think it's a decent card just in general. We've got the 4 Stadiums and the Marshadow to help protect against all these Power Plant decks that are pretty much... You know, there are 2 very big Power Plant decks in the format right now, so it's really important to have answers to those. The Malolanas, as I said, great, and then having the high raw energy counts makes me feel a lot more comfortable against Chaotic Swell. Swell is still prevalent in ADP lists. We've also seen Swell come into 1 or 2 Malamar players' lists in some recent tournaments, so having answers to Swell and just having more physical fire energies make your welders more live more often, so... the one risk with this 10-2 split is that you're less likely to be able to Miraculous Duo, but I think that's something that I can definitely manage. I think it's not a big issue. It's rare that you'll want to Miraculous Duo in any game regardless, so I like the 10-2 energy split right now. You could also think about adding in Energy Recycle System if you wanted to have even more means of recovering energy cards, or just go up to a 13th energy. Again, the Acrobike is flexible, but this is where I'm at with the list right now. You could also think about using this slot to become a second Solgaleo. So many other things. Mewtwo is very, very versatile. There's a lot of cards that I'm not playing right now, but I've tried to make it fairly vanilla, so that I still get the job done with Mewtwo more often than not, rather than trying to have the complete toolbox of tricks up my sleeve. For example, I'm not playing Latios, I'm not playing Naganadel. We're trying to really hone in on the most useful cards and just make that happen as much as possible, really. We'll move on to ADP, pretty much the second most successful deck in the format right now, based on the stats. And it really hasn't developed too much from some of the initial lists. I think the tech cards you'd always expect to see. Croagonal, Absol being a great card. This isn't always played, but I really think it's insane. The amount of Jirachi in the format right now, it's obviously going to be insane value. Good for mirror matches, good against Mewtwo, just for slowing them down and forcing them to find more outs, but also making Malolana much more difficult or more painful for the opponent, because they miss energy attachments just to retreat their Jirachis, or they have to find like additional switching outs alongside the Malolana. So this Absol is just a really nice card that I think works well with this deck, because oftentimes Reset Stamp is going to be a factor in your list, and you're trying to make comebacks with this card. So the Absol comes in clutch. You could also think about playing 2 copies. At the moment, I'm just at 1 and 3 com. You could flip-flop that if you wanted to. I think the 3rd Pokecom is my most flexible slot in the deck right now. I'm playing Mimikyu. It's a valuable card when there's mirrors and when there's Tinachomp around. So having Copycat available is pretty decent for sure. You've got your Giraffe Rig to try and remove Greninja GX from Mewtwo players, and it can also remove things that your opponent might want to Sinlin back as well. Things like Faber, they may want to get back if you're up against a a Power Plant deck. That are trying to get through Celtic Swell Keldeo combo. Sometimes you will get lost their Faber, so they can't Cynthia Caitlyn it back. So that's important. Croagonal, obviously good against the controlling decks, the Dolls and the Birds, and also can just buy you turns sometimes when your opponent's trying to scrabble for great catchers or custom catcher combos to try and close out games. Sometimes you can just deny that for a turn with Frozen Lock and buy yourself a turn to do whatever you want, which is cool. Keldeo is still an annoying, strong card, of course. The items really speak for themselves. There's not much craziness going on here at all. Again, Stadium's very standard. I'm still of the Bill's Analysis camp compared to the Rosa camp because of the lack of Dedenne that I play in my list. If you want to play Rosa, I feel like you have to play Dedenne, and that comes with its own whole heap of downsides. So I prefer playing 2 copies of Bill's Analysis in the Rosa slots because they're a decent turn 1 option for you. Basically, on turn 1, you are always happy to see things like Tag Call, any of your switching outs, comms. Those are all like the helpful cards on those opening turns. Rosa is obviously a dead card in the opening turn, so just making our opening stronger, I think, is value over Rosa. Yes, Rosa is guaranteed stamp on the turn and whatnot, but with the amount of Stellar Wish options that we have available, plus the Bill's Analysis, plus the fact that you've thinned probably like 6 or 7 energy out of your deck by the time you need Reset Stamp, I think it's completely fine to play Bill. If you want to play 1 Bill, 1 Rosa, that's also fine. It's like min-maxing in a way, but still decent for sure. I also prefer Cynthia over Lily, but that's another personal preference card, I guess. The Tag Call package is pretty thick in my list. You could also think about playing 3 Tag Call and a 3rd physical ADP if you're concerned about prizing this guy in matchups where he is the front man, compared to where Keldeo can sort of take over things like the Malamar matchup where you might want to have a 3rd copy of ADP, for example, just so that you don't prize stuff, you know. I've also added in the Choice Helmet once again. This was kind of in after the initial weeks of like straight after the Latin American International Championships, because we saw that you can tank certain attacks with the Choice Helmet, most notably against things like Mewtwo. Now I'm actually playing it for the Tinachomp matchup. Tinachomp trying to do that initial 40 poke while you attach pass into them, basically trying to get towards your Altered Creation GX. They will try and pressurize that Calamitous Slash as quickly as possible, so being able to Guzhala for the Choice Helmet is definitely a nice move there. Yes, the Weezing list can still be aggressive against you, but they need to have what do they need to have? 7 damage counters on you total. So that's like Roxy Weezings as well as the 40 damage prods here and there. If you want to tech further for the matchup, you can think about things like Mew. Mew's a decent card to put in the list. And also there's Great Potion as an option, especially when you're playing Bill's Analysis. Great Potion is a cool thing you can try and do to skew the Tinachomp matchup more in your favor. Still playing Counter Gain, got the double board. We are playing Rainbows over units, but that's also a flexible decision based on what you want to play. Now that Choice Helmet's back in the list, there's almost more reason to play the unit energies, the 1 water, the 1 metal one, over the 2 rainbows, because then you're more defended against Mewtwo, which is obviously a popular matchup, but Rainbow just means that if you're having to use things like Cynthia turn 2, you have 11 outs to attack rather than the 5 or the 6, based on which one you Guzma Halid on turn 1, so there's a lot more well, there's a lot less risk involved in playing the rainbows, so that's just something to bear in mind. But yeah, I think ADP is still solid. There are a decent number of archetypes out there right now trying to like tech certain cards of this deck, which is why I think we've started to see it in different forms. ADP has started to adapt from this vanilla shell, but I do still see it get the job done in recent tournaments, and I think the deck is still just fine as an archetype. We'll move on to Chomp now. This is kind of a newcomer, although it was seen in the Latin American Internationals by Gustavo. The list never really got leaked, and we were sort of in the dark about how this list played until later on at the American Regionals, where a handful of players played this. Obviously got the win there as well, and I've not changed a single card from their list. I still prefer the straightforward Chomp. I actually did a poll in one of the Facebook groups about which one was preferred, and I think a lot of people have moved over to the Roxy Weezing camp for which one they prefer. I still actually like this regular list. This list is more vulnerable to tech cards like the Choice Helmets of the world, like the Great Potions and such, and even Mew to an extent. So there is the debate around, trying to adapt to people's tech cards, and the Roxy Weezing build does do that more often. But I think this list is just more consistent in what it's trying to achieve. You find greens more consistently, and that's still like the crucial card to get your combo rolling. You have less dead weight cards in your hands, so Mysterious Message is normally drawing you more cards, and is just more effective as a strategy overall. I do think this archetype is pretty solid, though. I think it's got decent times against Mew 3 and ADP, which is the reason why it's doing so well, I think, overall. It's got the Weak Guard in here to try and help out against Guardian. Not sure if one copy is enough, though. You might want to up that count a little bit more just to be a bit safer against that matchup. But, of course, you oftentimes want to use Counter Gain as your colorless attachment, so you can see why they only play one Weak Guard, because it is quite painful to use that card in general. But Guardian, I think, is one of the reasons why this archetype has to be a little bit afraid. But other than that, I think its matchup spread is really solid. I also think it has a decent time against Control. When you've got the double Dust Stone, you can try and pop a few Mismagius early and just try and hit your stamps like turn 1, then turn 2, then turn 3. And you're just trying to, get through them with Fireworks Bomb plus Stamp combo, as quickly as possible. That's kind of what you're going for against the Control stuff. So, yeah, Chomp, very strong deck. And I'm playing the full combo list compared to, like, the Weezing Roxy, which is kind of combo, but also kind of, like, trying to set up damage for future turns. It's kind of worse in the early turns, better in the late game. That's the sort of trade-off you have to go for. Right, so that's those three. We'll go on to Malamar now. It's kind of got a new breath of life with the addition of a couple tag teams. I actually don't own the Trevnoir online. This demo account is faulty because it doesn't have the new promo, unfortunately. So I'm going to have to try and get my hands on that in some way. I can't actually trade on this account either, so I have to physically go out and get the code. And as you know, I don't like playing Malamar, so hands up, full clarity. I haven't tested the Trevnoir much, but the mentality is obviously strong. Pale Moon GX being a very strong answer to ADP. As soon as they use their GX attack, you can Pale Moon GX them, remove the energies so they can't get into Ultimate Ray, and that's going to be very ugly for them. They're back to manually attaching for a few turns where you can start spamming Night Watch against them, which is very strong as well. Night Watch is actually quite a good card against Green's decks in general. It's good against Chomp, it's good against Guardian. It's even decent against Control. Now, I know we can have a different matchup game plan against Control, where you knock out your own stuff with Giratina, and then you go into things like Blacephalon. But you can also go for just Night Watch in general, and whatever they're trying to Stevens into their hand, you can try and start Night Watching stuff away. So it's a good card against Green's decks, it's a good card against ADP. That covers a large portion. So that's pretty sweet. Also, it's like a big card to use in that late game when you're up against 2-hit KO style decks. They've got down to one prize. You just shove the Trevnoir in the active and make them go through that. Similar reason why we have the Giratina Garchomp on our own end. GG end can get rid of big threats that we would be very concerned about otherwise. Calamitous Slash being a great way to finish off games against tag teams, especially when we have spell tags and distortion doors on our side. So this guy's a great finisher for the deck in many regards, and can really help out against decks that are basically trying to beat Malamar by just spamming Malolana. This punishes them straight out the gate. And I remember in my early discussions with Malamar, I even remember pre the set coming out, I was saying that Malamar as we know it had to change, and we started to see the include of tag teams once again just to have more firepower, so you don't just lose to your opponent going Malolana, Cynthia Caitlyn back Malolana, and then Malolana again on like other turns. Having some more firepower in the list to disrupt those sorts of combos is pretty strong. We've got the Mimikyu in here to help out against Mewtwo. The matchup's not necessarily easy with this card. I think it's still losable, but I think it's certainly in your favor when you have Mimikyu and Fabba in the list. It should pretty much be weighted in your favor a lot of the time. We've got the Mew and the Blown as sort of spread damage techs and not much else in terms of techs. The Mimikyus come out the list. The other Mimikyu, the copycat Mimikyu. There's no Latios in here anymore either. I think those cards are kind of fluffy, and instead we're just going to have a high Acrobite count, so we actually get into the game. It's still the biggest concern about Malamar. We saw Azul and Danny do very well with their Malamar list that played 4 bikes. I've gone down to 3, just to make space for the Cynthia Caitlyn to recover Fabba. When you're up against Dolls, sometimes it's not enough to just Fabba 1 stadium away. Sometimes you need to Cynthia Caitlyn back Fabba to get rid of their second Sky Pillar. So you can do your Sprinkle shenanigans against them. So that's pretty sweet. We've got the Fishing Rod in here to try and get back spell tags and also like crucial techs. If like Mewtwo players, for example, if they play customs, you can get back your Mimikyu. It just means that you have more license to use your Acrobikes more aggressively. You can throw away tech cards like Tina Chomp or Trevnoir, which may be better later on in the game. Then you can Fishing Rod them back with relative ease. So I think that's one of the only changes I had to their 60. I think I also played Ditto, and I'm not sure if they did. I can't remember. Oh no, it's the fact that they only played 2 Switch, right? So I cut a bike for a Sinlin, and I cut a card for a Switch. I can't remember what it was. But yeah, very similar to their regional... successful regional list, not a regional winning list, but still pretty successful. Malamar, I think, is actually pretty well placed right now as well in the game. I think you have answers to Tina Chomp answers to ADP with this guy and this guy. You have pretty decent answers to Mewtwo just with Mimikyu Fabba and being Psychic. And I think against all of these green space decks that are just trying to Cynthia Caitlyn a bunch of damage off, once again, you have the Trevnoir and you also have the Tina Chomp. One card you could be considering in here is the Reset Stamp to make your Night Watch an even stronger card in more general matchups. So you can stamp your opponent down to 2 cards and then Night Watch away the other 2, and then they're in top deck mode, similar to how a Guardian tries to use its GX attack for full value. If you want to squeeze 1 or 2 stamps in here, I don't blame you. But I still don't trust Malamar enough to cut any more into the consistency than I already have done. So yeah, that's Mali right now. Let's look at Dollstall. Dollstall hasn't changed a huge amount for me. The one thing I have done is cut down to 3 Stealthy Hoods. I think Ability Zard is probably not in the top 5 most popular decks going into tournaments at the moment. So I'm being cheeky and just playing 3 Hoods and hoping that you don't have prizing issues in the matchup where it's relevant, and you can still get away with winning the matchup just by having, like 2 Flawless in play and like 1 Jirachi and such. I feel like you can still win that matchup quite happily with the Doll loop against them as long as you have enough Stealthy Hoods. So I feel like it's not worth teching more for that matchup. I have added in a Celebi right now to help out against the archetypes that want to put an Omastar into play. You can time spiral that Omastar, and then suddenly you're able to start resetting your Dolls. We've got the Channeler in here to get around Krogonal Lock, so as long as you're putting down double Doll, you can Lusamine Loop Channeler fairly consistently. A lot of ADPs have moved towards custom catchers rather than playing Manaphy, and that actually bodes well for you. So that's pretty decent. I think that's pretty much everything. I'm playing double Rainbow instead of 1 copy of Rainbow because I have so many attackers right now. We've got Spiritomb, we've got Celebi, we've got Giraffe, we've got Latios. Giraffe's actually an important card to make sure things stay in the lost zone, against you. And it can also be a reasonable mirror tech, but mirror techs aren't super important a lot of the time because the games are very difficult to... Well, I mean, it's kind of Bell reliant anyway, so the Giraffe isn't super good for that, but just getting rid of scary cards, the Giraffe is pretty good at doing. Making sure they can't come back to bite you and such. So, yeah, relatively standard Dolls. There's not too much change here. I think just the swap of a Hood for a Celebi is pretty much the biggest difference in the list, and making space for a second Rainbow. That's really all there is to it with Dolls. I still think the archetype's strong and is still underrepresented for the results it can churn out if you are a good player with the deck. Finally, Guardian. It doesn't necessarily have a huge amount of top 8s behind it, but I still think it's a solid archetype. And again, it's one of these that can have a decent time against the Mewtwo's, can have a decent time against the Chomp as well as ADP, thanks to type coverage, and also the fact that you play Dragon Charm now. Well, I play Dragon Charm at least. Definitely helpful against the Chomp decks. I think this really does feast on Chomp. You've got Great Pot, you've got Choice Helmet, and you've got Dragon Charm. That's a lot of answers to them. And you have natural type coverage against them as well, which is pretty sweet. Against the Mewtwo's, you have Stamp Plant, you have Psychic Charm, so that's all pretty good. Against the dodgy matchups, you got Lugia. You'll notice I have cut the Omastar from the list. I think Blacephalon Birds isn't a relevant enough archetype for me to respect enough to play Omastar. I think you can already beat the matchup. Not like easily, but you can already beat the matchup. But I'd say it's more unfavored when you don't play Omastar than if you do. But I do still think that the Omastar would come in the sort of mid-game anyway, and it just makes your stamps more effective, essentially. And I also think that other Flawless Doll players may start finding tech cards to answer Omastar, things like the Mimikyu GX, or like I'm playing the Celebi. So instead I'm going for Oranguru to recover custom catchers. It's more effective than you'd think, because you can try and even go for a Magical Miracle, set your opponent down to 0 cards, and on those turns you can be resource managing stuff back and making sure they're not trying to like mill out the things you put back into the deck. And you have greens access to the customs a lot of the time, especially because you can Cynthia Caitlyn back greens. There's nothing else you want to Cynthia Caitlyn back in that matchup, so you just keep recovering greens, grabbing back those customs, and start swinging into their bench. There's even a decent number of low hit point things that you can even attack with a Ranger if you really have to. So yeah, Guardian has a lot of tricks up its sleeve against Dolls, so I think the matchup is okay, even if you're not playing Omastar. Obviously, Omastar is very much like you win the game, whereas Oranguru makes you not instantly lose, but you still could lose the game depending on how Bella goes, basically, and how, or Belelba. I never get that pronunciation right, but you know what I mean. So yeah, Oranguru only takes up 1 space for Dolls. Omastar takes up 4 spaces for Dolls plus Baby Blown, and then like in random matchups that you can get it into play. But I've played maybe like 50 games of Guardian at this point in this format. It's been the deck that I've played most on ladder and on streams and stuff. And honestly, I didn't get Omastar out into play more than like 5 times. It feels like you need to prioritize your greens on other things, or you put your eggs into the Omastar basket and hope that its own disruptive element is stronger than getting instant reaction cards via the greens itself. So I found the card to be a little bit ineffective. Instead, I've devoted more space towards the tools that I think are way stronger against matchups right now, that are more relevant, and I also think that Oranguru can still help out against Dolls. So yeah, that's why we're rocking the Guru and opening up those spaces ready to play more tools to help out, I think, at least, a more relevant matchup in the game, especially because Choice Helmet is very good against mirror matches as well. Not many players in Mirror will be playing the Choice Helmet, so having an edge in Mirror is something that you can't under-respect either. This is a really nice mirror match card alongside the Great Pot as well. So yeah, Guardian, very, very solid. I think it's a little bit concerned about the greens Luke Metal that's popped up, the sort of Welder greens Lucario Metal deck, which I also really respect as well. I think it's strong. I was almost going to talk about the list on today's video, but I was already at 6 decks, and I didn't want to talk about many more because there's plenty of decks that are, in theory, stronger than the Luke Metal deck, and then I end up talking about 15 decks instead. But I think that's the only real auto loss for Guardian right now. I think it has decent times against pretty much everything else that we've seen on the list today. So yeah, let me know what you guys think about my 6 lists here. What is your favorite of these 6 decks? What do you think is going to win the final tournament we have in Standard for this format over in Bochum? I'll hear your thoughts down below. Is there any deck that I'm sleeping on right now? Do you prefer other builds of ADP? Do you prefer the other Chomp build? How do you build Mewtwo? I'll hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.